Okay. So 0 dark 30 is a function that's past a number. It's past the number at all times, and you want to return the same number except with no zeros, even if it's a decimal, right? So let's start by writing the function. So we could say function zero dark 30, and it's going to take a number, right? It's going to take a number. So the first thing that we should do is, if you read the README, you can see that it's saying, oh, well, if you just pass in a 0, return out a number. So we should do literally that, right? So if num triple equals 0, we can return an AN. So you see now, if we run 0 dark 30 and invoke it with 0, we'll get not a number. But if we do it with 1, if we do it with 10, we get undefined, because we're not doing anything else, right? And functions always implicitly return undefined if you do not use the return statement. Always remember that. But so we already handled our first edge case, right? Okay. So now, so if we pass in 1001, we should get 11. So how do we do that? You might be thinking that we want to loop through the actual number, but you can't loop through a number. They're not traversable, right? 1001 is a single value. So what can we do? What other types of values can we traverse through? Can we loop through? Strings, right? So we can just turn this thing into a string. And you could do that by saying num plus equals empty string. Num plus equals empty string is the same thing as saying string and then pass in, well, num equals string passed in with the num. No. Oh wait, does that work?
Is it the same
Yeah, no, this doesn't work. You can't do this with numbers. So let me show you something real quick. If you want to just Google like .toString and then to MDN, you'll see that the number, oh, this does number prototype .toString. What is this? An example. So why doesn't this work? Huh. So I guess you can't do it like... So I guess you have to make a number a variable first to use the toString property. I guess that is the case. So if you wanted to look up and see how a method works, you could just do what I did. You just do like .toString space MDN, and this is Mozilla's developer documentation, and it gives you a lot of examples, syntax, how to use it, what parameters it takes, the return value, and some other stuff. Big description, other examples. Aha! So you have to do it like this. you have to wrap the number in parentheses, and then you do .toString. And that will give you a string. So if you want to do a literal number, you have to wrap it around parentheses. I didn't know that because usually I'm dealing with variables. You can't just do it with a variable. If the variable is equal to a number, you could do .toString as well. But by far, all of these things, the most simplest thing is to just say num plus equals empty string. Because you're resetting num, right? Plus equals is short for num equals num plus whatever. And that whatever is an empty string. So when you do num plus equals empty string, it coerces that number, because you're adding it to a string, it coerces that number into that string. And then you add it to the empty string, right? And there are no characters in an empty string, so you won't get any excess spaces or anything like that, anything else. All you'll get is the string of whatever you're adding the empty string to. So that's one way to do it. And then, now that our number is now a string, so now this num should equal, if we pass this in, this should equal that, right? Can you guys see? In the back, you guys can see this? Is that better? Wish I could make this small. So we want to traverse through this thing, right? Now that we have a string, we want to go through. We want to loop through this string, and we want to do a check. We want to check and see if the current thing is a 0, right? That's the only thing we're looking for. Otherwise, we can just throw it into this other empty string, and then we'll get a string of numbers. They're actually, like, not numbers, but a string of numbers with no more zeros. So now we could set up our for loop. So for let I equal 0, I is less than num.length, and then I plus plus, right? So first thing we have to do, the only thing that this thing has to do is check and see if it's a 0. So you can do if number at num at I is equal to 0, or an even better way to do this, since you know it's a string and cleaner and less confusing, is if num of I just equals a string 0. You don't have to coerce it. You could just look and see, because you know it's going to be a string by now, right? We handled that already on line 9. We know that this is going to be a string, so you could just check and see if the current character here is a string 0. So if it's not a string 0, that's what we actually want to check. If it's not that, we want to say results string plus equals num of I. So if we hit a 0, this thing will be false. This will evaluate to false, right? Because a 0, it's saying if the string 0 is not equal to this string 0, that's false, because they are equal, right? So if it's anything else, a period or another number, this statement will be true, and then we'll push that thing into the result string. We'll add it to that empty string. Then, at the end, we can just return number coercion of results string. We can just pass the result string into the global number object. So we get 11. And we could say, let value equal that, right? And we could say console.log type of value. It's a number, and it's 11. We remove the zeros. So, if I put this in here, 10.01, we get 1.1, and it's still a number. Passing a decimal string into the number global object is still valid because it checks to see, before it coerces it into a number, if that is a legal number, right? And if we just pass 0 in here, we handled that already. It's not a number. Oh, that's super weird. So I guess type of not a number is a number. That's kind of weird. Not a number is really weird. Yeah. So that's the whole problem. Any questions? Any questions? Yeah.
So, like, starting with the edge case on this one.
Yeah.
That's usually like the best strategy, right? Knock out the easy ones.
Yeah, so you see, in this specific problem, right, it's asking you, like, if 0's passed in, return not a number, right? It's like, okay. So just put that in the front, and if it is a 0, none of this code will ever run. It'll just return what you want, and it won't waste any time. It won't bother reading the rest of the code, and you'll get exactly what you want. Any other questions? Cool. I can do another one. You guys want me to do another one? Number 3? Which one is number 3? Only one? So this thing is going to take 3 arguments, and it will return true if only one of them are true, right? Right? Is that what we're looking for? So, just comment this out. So let's start by writing the function block, right? So function only one will take in val1, val2, and val3. We're going to take in 3 values, and I'm choosing to call them val1, val2, val3, so you just know that they're 3 separate values. Okay? They're going to be different. So, the first thing that we can do is we can check to see if val1 is true, but val2 and val3 are false. Right? And then we can check if val1 and val3 are false, but val2 is true. Then we can check if val3 is true, but the first 2 are false. Only these things have to be false, right? Or false. And if all of these things, if there's no truthy value, or if there are more than one truthy value, you need to return false. I think that's the problem, right? Yeah. So, this is just literally a bunch of if blocks, right? You just have to check these specific things and see if that case passes, right? So first let's check to see if val1 is true, but these 2 are false, okay? So we can say if, open up your thing, open up your curly braces, open up the block, and then we could say, bang bang, val1. What does that do? Exactly. This returns the Boolean value of whatever val1 is. So, we're going to say if this. that means this if block will run if this is true. If this equals true. If what is returned is true, right? By using the bang bang, you get what it is. So you could say and val2. Because this will return true if val2 is falsy. Because it's inverse, right? It returns true if val2 is not true, the not operator, right? And the and symbol, this if statement will pass if both of these things are true. So we're seeing if this is true, if val1 is actually true, and not val2 is true, right? And then you could just do the same exact thing with val3. Because we only want one of them to be true. We only want one, okay? So, if this is true, then you could just return true. Is anyone confused by that? Anyone? Okay. So now, we pretty much have to do the same check, except we have to check if value 2 is the only truthy thing, right? So, we really just reverse what we did before, except the double bang will be for val2 this time. Everyone get that? It's the same thing as this if block, except now we're checking to see if val... Oh, I forgot the 1. If val1 and val3 are false. Because the bang operator says, okay, if this value is false, then I want to return true. If this value is true, I will return false. That's what the bang operator does, right? And the double bang just returns a Boolean value. If it's truthy, it will turn true, and if it's falsy, it will return false. Does everyone understand how that is working? The double bang versus the regular bang. Okay. So now that we check that one, we really just have to do the same exact thing, except here we do bang val1, bang val2, and now we're seeing if val3 is truthy. And these and symbols are checking to see if everything is truthy. Yeah.
Yeah, so on the and operators, everything has to be true on both sides. Both sides of the
Yeah. If an OR operator, only one of these things will be true. Only one of these things needs to be true. So the
That's
reason
true
we...
for like as many ands as you have.
Yeah, pretty much. If you have like a million ands, and in the middle there was a 0, the whole equation would be false. And it would return, I can't remember what it returns the first. And returns the first false equal, so it would return 0. But the reason we're not using OR here, we're checking to see if this is false, and this is true, right? If there is an OR here, and this was true, but this is false, right? If this is false, then this would coerce that to true. Wait, did I say that correctly? So we're saying if this was an OR, we would be saying inverse val. If this is false, this would return true, right? So this would be true. This would be true. Or even if this is false, right? So if val1 is equal to false and val2 is equal to false and val3 is equal to false, just because these are inverted, these return true, and this OR will make that statement true. Because the thing on the left is true, But val3, double bang, returns false. So these things will return true, but this will return false. But the OR will still return true for the whole thing, and that's not what we want, right? We want to check specifically if two things are false and one thing is true, right? And making sure that this equals true, and this equals true, but the values are false, false, and true, then we will return true. And if we make it through all of the if statements, then you just return false. Because you know what we're looking for, whatever the three things are passed in, you know, it won't hit any of the if statements, so then you just return false. So if you do only one of like AA, 5, and 4, you get false, because there are three true things. If you do two true things, you also get false. But if you do two falsy things, you get true. Yeah. You can make this into a giant else if you wanted to. So like, you'll get the same thing. If you wanted to do it that way. Or you could just make three different if statements. Because you know in this particular function, you're going to want to run through the whole code. So 3 if statements, it'll be like, and inside the if statements. So the main difference between if, else blocks and just 3 like if blocks would be if you're not returning a value inside of the if blocks, the rest of the code is still going to run, right? Like, if you go back to what I had before, right? If you go back to what I had before, imagine I wasn't returning true here. Like, if I changed all these returns to console.logs, oh, this is always going to be false. But if only one was true, you would get true and false. An if and else block will take care of that because it's one block. They're all connected, right? You're saying if these two things aren't true, you will do the thing in the else. But if this is not true, else if that is true, then the else block won't be hit. And in that case, the else block was false. But this is okay to do in this situation because we have return values. And if you're running through the code and you hit this return, the rest of the function stops running. We have our return values. We got what we wanted from the function. Does everyone understand that? Yeah, you can. You could just pretty much this or this or this. And it's the same thing. I'll make this clear so you guys could read it. So what this is saying, it's all in one if block, and it's saying that I need this to be true, or I want this to be true, or I want this to be true. One of those things, then we'll just return true. It makes sense because there were 3 if statements before, and you're writing return 3 times. But they're all returning the same thing. They're all returning true, right? So you can just wrap this all in one if, put the and statements in parentheses, because that makes them individual expressions, you know? And then it will evaluate everything inside the parentheses before it looks at this, that, you know? And only one of those things needs to be true. Yeah.
Something a little different seemed to work. I took the variables and I created a new variable and said let sum equal zeros. And then I said let sum equal, I added each.
Well, I could take a look at your code after if that's cool. Okay. You guys ready to learn about scope? Scope is actually super important. It's more of like a conceptual thing, but like everything uses scope, right? So let's start scope. So basically, there's going to be 3 types of scope. There's going to be global, functional, and block. These are the 3 different types of scope. Scope literally refers to which variables can be accessed at what point of time in your code. That's all it is. Like the fact that if I say let hello equal hello, console.log hello, the fact that this console.log has access to this hello is scope. Because hello is in the global scope, the outermost scope, and so is the console log. But scope gets a little tricky when we talk about functions and things that are in blocks, like for loops, while loops, if statements, okay? Basically, the thing to remember is that if you define a variable inside of a function or inside of an if statement or a for loop or a while loop using let, not var, let, then everything outside of that function will not have access to that variable. But the function code will have access to variables defined outside of it. Let me show you all what I mean. It's a little confusing to wrap your heads around. Maybe I didn't explain it the best way. But basically, let's say we have a function, right? Well, let's say we have a global variable here, right? Global equals global. Okay? And this is just the page of the application, right? There's nothing else here. So this is in the global scope. Then let's say we have a function. Not global. And then inside this function, we console.log global. And then here, we will run not global. This works, right? This is defined outside of here, outside of the function. Everything inside of the function will be in functional scope. But since this is defined outside in global scope, and the function is defined in global scope, it has access to it. This thing will look one level outside of it. first it looks inside of the function for what is global, right? When we're calling not global here, it says, okay, JavaScript says, okay, where is not global? Oh, here's not global. Let's see what it does. Oh, it console.logs global. What is global? It's not defined inside of function, inside of not global. So it looks one step up, and it's defined here. But if you want to say, will this log equals to nope, and you console.log, will this log, you get an error. Will this log is not defined. Because will this log is being defined inside of this function using the let keyword. If I did this with var, oh, no, because this is a function. Sorry. I'll save that example for later. That will happen in block scope, not function scope. Functions are a little different. So it says that will this log is not defined because will this log is defined inside of this function. And we're calling it outside here, but when JavaScript is looking for the definition of will this log, it only looks up. It doesn't look down into everything, right? And this is global scope, right? This is sitting in global scope. Does everyone agree with that? Everyone agrees with that. That's global scope. There is nothing higher than global scope. So it says, oh, it's not here, not defined. But not global, it does have something to go up to. Inside of this function, it does have something to go up to, right? It goes up to the global scope and looks for what that function is. So let's say here, inside this function, we define another function called test. And then we will say console.log will this run, will this log, sorry. And then we'll also console.log global. And then inside of this function, we will call test. Does everyone understand what's going on right here? Yeah.
So can you put below the let global that will this log will
Can I?
go outside of the function, so it's also
Wait. Say that again.
Can you put let will this global or will this log equal note underneath versus let global equal global, so that is outside of the function and then will call?
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yeah. This. Well, I'll show you. Look. So this. Let me just walk through what's going on right now with the example I just did. Right. So this is just defining a variable global and setting it to a string. Right. Is everyone cool with that? I'm also defining a function called not global, and then it does a bunch of things. Okay. Don't worry about those things right now. But you guys understand, in the global scope, there is a function not global, right? And then, at the end, we are invoking not global. So JavaScript sees that this function is being invoked. It sees that it's a function. So it says, okay, let's see, what's it doing? It's creating a variable inside of it, will this log, and that's equal to nope. Then it console logs global. It says, what is global? I don't see this anywhere in the scope of this function, the functional scope. So let me go one step up. One step up, in this case, is the global scope. It finds it, global's here, so it console logs global. Then it keeps running, and it sees another function definition. This function is called test. It console logs this, will this log, and it console logs global. But it doesn't, this is just defining something, right? It's not doing anything. But at the end of not global, we're actually calling test. We're invoking test. So, if JavaScript says, okay, where's test inside of this function? It's right here. It sees, test runs then, and it says, JavaScript says, what is will this log? I don't see it inside of this functional scope. So it goes one step up, and it looks at this scope. Does everyone understand that? It goes one level up and tries to find what that variable is. That's defined right here. Nope. Logs nope. Then it console logs global. Again, test global is never defined. So it goes up to not global. But is global defined in not global? No. So it looks through that function, it sees there's nothing called global, but it sees that there's another scope still up ahead. There's the global scope. So then it looks through the global scope, the entire page, and it finds global, and then it console logs it. So the same thing will happen if you just move this out. If you put this outside into the global scope, it's being called inside the functions, so those functions inside will have access to that. Does everyone get this? Who has questions? Yeah.
I'm just not getting the same result as you. Like mine says no and global, not global and global. And
Yours says nope and global.
yeah,
Are these two in the same order?
yeah, same as yours.
Is this here? Let me see if I missed something. But be careful. So, you can pass functions parameters, right? Right? You can pass functions parameters. So what would happen if I passed test, if I just said that test takes a parameter, and I'll call that parameter global. And then I'll pass in hello world. Oh, then I'll pass in hello world. As you can see, since I'm saying that test now takes a parameter that has the same name as this up here, this is completely valid, by the way. And then you throw hello world into test, invoke it with that. Test function isn't going to go all the way up first and look for something. The test function is going to look within itself. And the parameter is inside of this function, right? If I said, and since it's the same name as this, you might get confused and saying, why isn't it logging global? Why isn't it accessing this? Why can't I name this? It's because inside of a function scope, you can name things using let, and parameters use let behind the scenes. The same name as something else. Like, I can say in here, let hello equals hello, and I could say let hello equal second hello. Then I could console log here hello inside of test, and you get second hello. You can name these things the same thing if it exists in an outer scope. In the inner scope, you can do that, okay? Same thing goes, like if I now wanted to say this is hello, is this? Oh, I'm console logging global. Oh, shit. Where is that? Oh, here. Don't worry about that. Console.log hello. Oh, can I not do this? What if can I do this? Huh. Maybe this is a bad example. I'm just like confusing everybody, including myself. But the main point is that this parameter can be passed and can be called the same name as something in a higher scope. But if you try to console log it, it will be the thing at the lower scope, right? Like when we console.log hello here. You get second. So what if you don't even pass something in here, right? So what, let me delete these hellos. So what if you don't pass something into test, but test takes a parameter? What do you think is going to happen? What do you think will happen when you console log global? Hmm? You think so, right? You get undefined. Because when you're defining a function and you give it a parameter, JavaScript is doing this, basically. Not literally, but basically doing this. It's just declaring a variable for that function to use, but since you're not passing that function anything when you invoke it, it's not assigned anything. So, by default, it's undefined. Just like here, if you were to pass in something here, and then you just say global is just declared a variable here, it's undefined when you try to console log it on line 56. Does everyone understand that? No?
It's kind of like not returning.
Hmm?
It's like not returning.
Well, no, that's why you get this undefined. That's why you get the green undefined. This undefined here, when you're trying to console log global, and global is set to nothing. So it's undefined.
Why would it not just continue defining? I put something in the test, it's still set.
Because this global is not this global. This global is this global.
So I'm putting something in where it says test that should come up, but it's not.
Well, you have to invoke test down here, and that's where you throw a string in. You pass something into it,
Yeah.
it gets passed into test, so global is now this string something, and then it console logs global, it looks within its scope, and it says, what is global? Oh, it was passed in as something, so it should console log something. Okay. Now let me show you guys something else. Still to do with scope. So, if I say console.log what is this? And then here I say let, oh, this is a bad example. So I say var, I'll use var right now. So there's something wrong with my REPL, I'll explain in a second, but so I'll use let first, right? So let what is this equals to nothing. So you get a reference error in my REPL for some reason, but let should do this, the same thing as var does. It should console.log undefined. Okay? Let and const and var, if you declare something, something happens called hoisting. Hoisting is basically the compiler runs through the entire application and it looks for declarations. It looks for let, it looks for var, it looks for const, and it looks for functions. And if it finds a declaration that's a let, a var, and a const, it immediately sets it equal to undefined. Okay? So that's why we get undefined here. I don't know why let doesn't work here, but that's what it is, you know? So if you do this, then you get nothing. But what if you say function, wait, hold on, function test. What am I supposed to do here? Oh, yeah, this is what I do. So this works as well. So you define the function test before this variable is declared. But inside of test, you're accessing that variable. But you're calling it down here, right? So once it's called, it runs through everything. It defines what is this to nothing. And then it calls it, and then it console logs what is this up here. And then you get nothing, right? But if you do it like that, you try to invoke test before this is defined, then you get a reference error. What is this is not defined? This function is trying to, the code is reading it like this. Oh, it sees test. Before I go to the next line, I have to invoke this. So it doesn't know what's after this line. So it runs this function and it tries to console log what this is. Again, if this, in this REPL, if this was var, you'd get undefined. But let throws an F reference error in this for some reason. That's not what happens, really. So the same thing is true for blocks. So you could say, like, if true, let won't run equal nope. And you could console.log won't run, and it will tell you that won't run is undefined. It's not defined, right? Because you're defining won't run inside of a block, an if block. The same thing is true for for loops and while loops if you use let only. If you say var, you do get this. And that's why var isn't that good. Okay? Let limits definitions to where they're defined. var in block scope, not function scope, in block scope, if you use var over here, everything outside of it still has access to it. In blocks. Not function, not local scope, that's different. In block scope, like if you have a function that's running a bunch of for loops and if statements and things like that, and inside of those big if statements and for loops, you have to define like counter variables and stuff. The outside of those if statements and for loops will have access to those variables as well. Does everyone get that? So like, here I can say, let me just see if this will work. I don't think like you could do this now. Yeah, but you can do this. Oh, shit. Aha, but you're reassigning it, right? So, if I do this, wait, hold on. And this is where things get buggy. This is what I was trying to show you. So here we're saying var won't run is equal to DDD, right? And then we say if true, so it's always going to run inside there, we declare won't run equal to no. It lets you do this, but it's overwriting the outer variable. So when we console log won't run over here, we get no. But if you switch var to let, you still get DDD. And that's like that's the main difference with var and let. var is not block scoped, but let is. So you can, if you're using var, you can like overwrite a lot of variables. So that's why it's best practice to just not use var, ever, really. Yeah. Like using let?
Yeah.
So like if I say let won't run over here, this is going to throw an error. Because it's saying won't run is already defined here, inside of this scope. If what wasn't here, this, then it would be 0. This won't run here has absolutely nothing to do with anything that is going inside this if statement. But if I did this, and I don't declare this, oh, sorry, I meant to comment this out. Won't run is now nope. Because you're not saying, okay, I'm declaring a new variable inside of this block, and I'm going to call it won't run. You're not doing that. You're saying won't run. You're accessing something won't run, and it's saying, what is won't run? Oh, it's this right here. And you're reassigning it to no. How does everybody feel about this? Feel okay? Pretty much, if you're inside of a function and you're trying to access a variable, it will look all the way up to the outer scope, to the outermost scope. And if it can't find anything, it'll throw you an error. If it does, it'll use that variable, even if it's not inside of the scope. But if you say, like, if you're trying to access, a function, if you're trying to access a variable inside of a function that lives inside of an if block in the function, you just won't be able to do that. Because it doesn't go down, it goes up. Okay? Okay. So let's look at some slides, yeah? So in these slides, we'll talk about like what scope is, types of scope, global, functional, also known as local, and block, and scoping best practices. Okay? So, scope is, it refers to which variables can be accessed by your code at a specific location in your code, right? So you see here, it's saying let wow is equal to a string wow, and at console.log, this is a typo, it should be this whole thing. At console.log, it's this, and you get wow, right? But, oh, there's no scope. So global scope, so JavaScript is lexically scoped, which means the location at which a variable is declared determines its scope. Okay? A variable that is declared outside of a function is globally scoped, and it can be referenced from any line of code throughout the file. So you see, let global equals ear, console.log outer, and then we'll say this variable. And then in this function, we'll make a function called funfunction. It'll console log inner and then global. And if you run funfunction, you'll get outer ear, inner ear. Because global is defined in the global scope, right? And since this function is defined also in the global scope, well, it doesn't really matter. If this function was defined somewhere even further down, it will still look all the way up to see what this word is, what global is, what is this variable. It'll go all the way up and find global in the global scope, and it equals ear. Its value is ear, a string ear, right? Does everyone understand? Okay. So, even though a global variable can be referenced from anywhere in your code, the value assigned to the variable cannot be accessed until after the assignment operation occurs. So, if you console.log wait for it here, nothing has been assigned to wait for it. It has no idea what this is, so it's undefined. But then you say let wait for it equals here I am, and then you console log it here, and then you get here I am. And this is where hoisting comes into play. JavaScript ran through this whole thing. The compiler ran through the whole thing before it executed any of the code, just looking for declarations. It found one, wait for it, and it put that in memory and said this is equal to undefined. And that's why you get undefined. You don't get like a crazy error. Even though I showed you getting a crazy error in my REPL, but like that won't happen in any code base that you ever worked on. That just won't happen. I think there was something weird with my settings in REPL or something. So, variables declared inside of a function are locally scoped. That is local scope. Functional scope, right? So, they can't be referenced outside of the function. So if you say function, happy function, and then inside of this function, inside of the declaration of this function, you say let message equals I am so happy, and you console.log message here. When you run happy function, this is going to run, right? So you run happy function, and it console logs I am so happy, because message inside of here is here. But then, in the global scope, it tries to console log message. And you get reference error, message is not defined. You get a reference error here because there is no let message equals anything in the global scope where you're running this console log. Right? This message was defined inside of this function. So things outside of this function can't have access to this. This thing doesn't know about anything inside here. It just knows the name of this function. That's why we could run happy function in this global scope, because the function is declared out here. If there was another function surrounding this called sad function, and you tried to run happy function in the global scope, that would throw an error too, because it's not defined in the global scope. It's defined in functional scope. Does everyone get that? Trying to access things defined inside of a function can't be done from outside of it. That's the main message. Okay? Is everyone okay? Like, for real? You can ask a question if you guys have questions. Okay. So what if a variable is defined locally and globally? I showed you this, so let message equal think globally. And then function log a message. Then we're going to say let message equal act locally. JavaScript will look for message locally first. So when you console log message inside here, when you invoke it down here, you're going to get act locally. Because when you're calling this function, the function's running, and then it says, okay, JavaScript's like, what is message? What is that? So it looks inside of here, oh, message is defined as this, and then that's what it console logs. It doesn't look higher if it finds something. If you remove this, think globally would be console.
Does it matter where, what position that is in?
Like if you console log this message before defining this,
I mean, if that line 3 is down after,
if this is here,
yeah, if it's like in line 7 somewhere,
oh, if this was inside of the function, if this message, let message equal think globally, was moved to inside of the function, there would be a huge error. Because you're saying in the same scope, let message equal this, then let message, wait a second, message is already defined in this scope. You can't define something with the same name inside of the same scope using let, or anything. Like you would have to change it to messages or something. Any other questions? Okay. So what if a variable is defined locally and globally? So, like I said before, if you change the name of this to MSG, no longer message, and this is console.logging message, it will look inside of this function and say, wait a second, what is message? This word is not defined in here. Let me go up. And then it finds it here, so you get think globally. If it can't find it locally, JavaScript will look at the scope outside function. In this case, the global scope. But it always goes one step further. Okay? One step out, and then it looks. Then if it can't find it there, it goes another step out. Looks over there. Until you get the global scope. Because there's nothing past that. There's nothing past the global scope. It's global. There's no universal scope. So parameters are also locally scoped, okay? So if you let message equal think globally, and then you define a function called log_a_message that takes a parameter that is called message, and then you console log message, and then you invoke log_a_message with a string, you get think act locally. Because this is defining a variable pretty much as message. If you didn't pass anything in over here, like I showed you, this would be undefined. Because message is still declared locally. You're declaring a message variable by putting it as a parameter. Then you pass it an argument, and then message in here will be whatever that argument is. And if you don't pass it an argument, it's going to be undefined. Does everyone get that? Is everyone okay? You guys are super quiet. It's confusing, is it?
Yes.
What's confusing about it?
I mean, I understand what you're saying, but like, it is confusing to understand.
No, for sure. This stuff is super confusing, honestly. You guys will get better. That's pretty much what happens. You guys will just keep doing problems and problems in the workshops. You'll keep working with each other, and you'll eventually something like scope will just be like, oh, this is just a thing that happens, and I know about it already because I'm good. And it'll happen eventually, okay? Like scope is more of it's just like a part of programming. There's no way around it. It's just like rules in programming. It's not like solving complex problems. but it's just rules behind the problems that you're trying to solve, the code that you're writing. So it's like, it just comes better with practice, honestly. And if you guys are feeling a little discouraged or something, like maybe you're not getting anything, don't freak out, okay? You can always ask me for help. You can always ask your partners for help, your peers, and we'll figure something out. People learn at their own pace, okay? This stuff was not easy for me when I started learning, and I did not have a computer science background, okay? And if maybe you are coming from a background of having a computer science bachelor's degree, or maybe even experience as an engineer somewhere else, use your knowledge to help others around you that might be struggling. Because if you get something, but your partner doesn't, explaining it to them clearly enough over and over again until they understand it will help you learn more, because then it will strengthen your knowledge as well. Okay? Just like a little confidence booster. So back to functional scope. So consider next nested functions. So I showed you this one. So you say let global var is equal to a string global, right? And then you say you're defining this function outer. Inside of the definition of outer, you're saying let outer var equal outer. Then you're defining another function called inner. Let inner var equal inner inside of an inner function. And then you're going to console.log global var, outer var, inner var. Then, at the end of the outer function, you're going to invoke inner. Then in the global scope, we'll be invoking outer. So, when outer is invoked, it's going to go down here. Okay, outer var is now created. It's declared as outer. This function is defined here, and then it invokes inner. So then inner is now running, and it says let inner var equal inner. Okay, another variable is declared. And then you get the console log. JavaScript looks for what global var is. It's not inside of inner, so it looks one step outer, right? And outer is the outer function, so it looks for what global var is there. It's not there either, so it goes one step out. And that step happens to be the global scope. So if it's not there, that would be undefined, but it's defined here, so you get global. Then it looks for outer var. What is outer var? Oh, it's not defined inside of inner, so it goes one step out, and it sees outer var. Same thing with inner var, except inner var is defined inside of that function. Okay? So consider nested functions again. What is the difference between these two slides? Okay, so you have collision here, which is in the global scope. You have outer and inner function, just like last time. Then you're passing collision into outer, and that is a string outer, right? And then you console.log inner, and then you say let collision equal inner, and you just console.log collision. So you just get inner. Because the only thing you're console logging in all of this is here inside the inner function when you're invoking it. So first thing it does is look at its own scope, and it says, oh, okay, let collision is equal to inner, so that's all you get. Even though all of those have the same name. It sees in the innermost scope that that thing is defined, so it won't bother looking out. Okay? Yeah.
Can I just go over that again?
This is a little confusing. So we have a variable head. Here, I'll code it out for you. So we have a variable out here, right? So we say let collision. Oh my god, collision. And we're going to say that equal to global. Right? And that's just in the global scope. Does everybody agree? So then, we have a function called outer, and it's going to take a parameter, but I'm going to name that parameter collision. Okay? So now inside of outer, if we want to access something called collision, it will reference whatever this is. Not this, this, inside of this function. So let's say that then inside of outer, we have another function called inner. And here we say let collision equal to inner. And then inside of inner, we will console.log inner. And then outside of inner, we will call inner. And then outside of outer, we will call outer, but pass in outer. So, at the end here, when we're calling outer with the string outer, let's see what happens. Let's take this value and throw it into our function and see what happens. Do you guys agree that this parameter collision will now be equal to outer? Right? If you invoke it with outer, collision will now be equal to outer, this collision. So then, as you go through the function, this right here from line 88 to 92, 91, is just a declaration. So it has a declaration, it's fine, it's there. But then at the end of outer being invoked, inner is invoked. So then you go to inner. It's invoked with nothing. You're not passing anything. Inner doesn't take a parameter. So now that inner is running, it makes a definition here, collision. Let collision equal inner. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do this. Let collision equal inner. So now we're inside of inner. Inner's running because it was invoked here. Once you console.log collision, this console.log will look, JavaScript will say, what is collision? I don't know what this is. Let me go see what it was defined as. And the first thing it will do is look at its own scope. And is there a variable called collision that is being defined inside that scope? Yes. And that, I never ran. And that is what you get. Is that a little more clear? It sees a variable here. It looks for what it is. First thing first, it looks at its own scope, which is here and here. It's in this function, right? The inner function. And it finds it, so that is what is being console. If I console logged collision out here, you would also get outer, then inner. But if I did it here, after you invoke inner, you would get inner, then outer, right? Because collision at this point, it's not going to look into inner. JavaScript's going to run this collision and see like, hey, wait a second, you're trying to console log collision. What is collision, right? Let me look in my own scope. It sees a function called inner. It doesn't go into inner, it just sees that this is something called inner. It's not called collision, so it ignores it. But it sees that collision is being passed in as a parameter over here, right? Which is the same thing as saying let collision, right? You're defining something called collision is being defined. But its value is only assigned, because it's a parameter, if you pass something into that function. So that is why you get outer in that situation. Like if I removed this, it would be inner undefined. Okay. It's okay? A little bit better, maybe? Maybe? I don't know. Yeah, so this is pretty much the same example, the same exact example as before, except now inside of inner, you're no longer saying let collision equal inner, right? You're just saying console log collision. And since there's no more declaration of collision inside of inner, it will look to its outer scope. And its outer scope is outer. And you might not think outer is not being defined anywhere, right? You might think it's not anywhere, but it is because it's in the parameter. This is a defined variable, well, a declared variable, so it looks and checks and sees what the value is, and it's outer, because that's what you're calling it with, right? So outer is console logged in this scenario. Okay? So now, here, if I don't define a parameter, but I'm still passing in outer, and I no longer am declaring this, the thing that is logged is global. Even if you pass a value into a function, right? I'm passing outer into it, right? So even if I'm passing that into it, outer, you're not defining a parameter here. You're not defining a variable here. So like you could throw like a million things into this, right? It doesn't matter because outer will not reference that. It doesn't care. Nothing in your scope, nothing in your function accesses that. So inside the inner function, when it's ran, it looks to outer, it sees there's no definition, it sees there's no parameter, and then it looks out again, but collision is defined over here. And if it's not defined anywhere, then you're screwed, because collision is not defined, right? It went to the outermost thing, found nothing, and that's what you get. But in this case, you get global. So that's what this example is showing. You can pass parameters into functions, but if you don't account for them, they won't be accessed. They won't be accessible. Note the inner function can access the scope of the outer function, but the opposite is not true. So this is like when I was saying, like, if you define a variable inside of a function, things outside of the function can't have access to those things, right? The same thing goes with functions inside of functions. So here, we have a definition and then outer is being invoked. So inside of outer, let outer var equal outer, right? Everyone cool with that? Then there's a definition of inner. And in inner, let inner var is equal to inner, and it's going to console.log outer var and inner var. Then we're going to call inner, and then after inner is finished running, we will console.log inner var. Line 11 is not inside the inner function. Line 11 is only inside the outer function. So, when inner is invoked, it runs, it sees outer var, it looks for outer var, it says, what is this? It's not inside inner, but it is defined in outer, so you get outer. Then it console logs inner var, it looks for this, it says, okay, where is inner defined? Oh, it's inside my own function. I won't even look further. I'll do this. Then, after that's done running, we go to the last line of outer. And it says, what is inner var? It's not going to look inside that, right? It's not going to look for that variable. And then it sees that inner var isn't defined anywhere inside of outer function, and it's not defined anywhere in the global scope. So you get a reference error. Inner var is not defined. Get it? A little bit? The inner function still looks for a local declaration of the variable name before looking at the next level. So you see here, I think I showed you to this maybe 20 minutes ago, but if outer var is defined in the outer function, and you're console logging outer var here, but you're saying this function is now defined with a parameter that's also called outer var, right? But you don't pass inner anything. So when your console log outer var here, it sees that something was declared, and it's undefined. It doesn't look further once it finds a declaration. Its value is just undefined because you're not passing inner a value. If you pass the string outer here, if this string was passed into here, then it would be outer inner. But you don't pass anything here, so you get undefined inner. Cool? Any block of code inside of curly brackets, creates its own scope as well. And now when I'm talking about curly brackets, I'm talking about if statements. I'm talking about if else statements. Then I'm talking about for loops and while loops. So those have their own scope as well, block scope. So if you try to console log block, and block is defined inside of this if block, you get this reference error, right? This, inside of this, you can console log block because it's in here, so you get Jenny from the block. The block isn't defined anywhere out here, and it works the same way as functions. It will never look for a variable inside of a block. It just won't do that. The pre-ES6 var keyword ignores block scope. So as you can see, if you console log block, if it's block, if you're defining it with var, you do get that here. That's a little dangerous. Just do not use var, really. There's no reason to do that. Always use let. Honestly, always use const, unless you know you're going to want to reassign something. Okay? Do you guys know about const? Okay. Const is just you can't reassign it later. Okay. Functions generally should not change globally scoped variables. That's best practice, right? If you define something inside of the global scope and then you're writing a function, generally you're not inside of the function, you're not going to want to change what that value is, right? You're going to want to make a new value, use the outer value, and do something like if you have a string outside of a function and it's like yay long, whatever. And if you want to remove certain characters, you shouldn't be like removing the characters from that string. You should be looping through the string and pushing characters into another string, right? Let always true is equal to true. Function don't mind me, always true is equal to false. This is changing this. So now, if always true, if you were expecting this to run, it's not, because don't mind me is being invoked here, and it's changing don't always true to false. So, all is well is not going to be console logged. You're throwing a new error, everything is broken. So, like there's a global object, a global array, number, string object, there's also a global error. So if you know like there's going to be like an else condition that will be an error, you could just say throw new error and pass it a string, and then you'll get like a red statement with whatever you said. That's why that's happening. Throw is a keyword, new is a keyword. Okay? So you can't like name variables new or throw. Okay? Some other best practices. Functions generally should not change globally. Oh, I just said, is this the same slide? Oh, okay. So this is okay because now we're not. Now before we had no let keyword there, right? So then it's saying, what is this? Oh, it's here. We're going to reassign it. But since this isn't a block, this isn't a function. Inside this function, it's just defining another thing called always true. And it's just setting it equal to false. So, when you run don't mind me, the only thing that happens is that a new variable is declared to be used inside of this function and this function only, and it's going to equal false. That's it. Then we continue our code, and if always true, that's still going to be true. Console.log all is well. So the else statement never runs. Yeah. Yeah, so in this scenario, like if there was no let here, let is a keyword that's saying I'm declaring something, right? I'm declaring a new variable. And since let is block scoped, since let is block scoped, you can name this the same name as something else up here without having anything to do with this variable, right? So this is saying, okay, I'm going to make a new variable called always true. If there was no let there, this function is saying, okay, where is always true? I'm going to look through my own scope and find always true. It's not. It's not here, right? So it looks up. And outside of that is the global scope. And it finds always true is defined here. And then it does whatever it is. It sets it equal to false. So now, if you console log always true down here, it would be false if the let keyword wasn't there.
So without the let, then it draws a different expression.
Say that again?
Like, without the let, it'll draw over globally to find a variable.
Right, because
But with the let, it's like it's a new expression.
it's a different variable. You're defining something new with the let keyword. Otherwise, you're running an expression, right? You're saying this, you're assigning something with that. Like if you did if this was a number, if this was 5, and you did always true plus equals 5, then always true would be 10, right? Without the let. But if you say let always true equal 10, there will be just a variable in here that's 10, 5, whatever. So the let saying, okay, I'm going to define a new variable called this. But if it's not there, it will show you that, okay, I'm going to reassign whatever always true is to this value, and it will look up, so this will be reassigned. So basically, things inside your functions just should not be changing values that are defined globally.
You set a new variable function. We usually wouldn't all the same way.
Yeah, I mean,
That's just
it's kind of different. But if we're talking about block scope and we're using let, right? What if you have two for loops doing two different things in a function? You don't have to change it. You can say let I as much as you want if they're not inside of each other. If you have a for loop inside of a for loop and the outer one says let I, you do have to change the. You have to say let y. Because I is already defined in that scope. I think so. 1 second. I don't think you could do this. Aha. Okay, so this you can do, but I would never do that. You know? Because now, since you have two things of the same name, let I and I, if you're trying to say, like, if you were passing a string in here, and you were trying to, like, traverse through it, like, 2 times or something, you would never know, like, which I is which Like if you wanted to access, I don't think. Oh, no. So you can't access this. Like if you say, let I, you can't access this variable. I think let I equal I, except in the definition. Oh, wait a second. Let I equal to I. Yeah, so that's just weird. I just wouldn't do that. Yeah. So, yeah, so don't change global variables. That's one best practice. Another thing is just to avoid cluttering the global namespace with lots of variables. So generally, when you're writing a lot of code or something, you don't really want to just, in the global space, just create variables that are like one string, or one array, or something like that. You don't really want to clutter them. You want to save your variable declarations for inside of functions. Like I've seen some people in workshops like they write their function and then they create another variable outside of that function. Don't do that. You don't need to. You won't have to do that for anything. Okay. So it's just like you don't want to clutter your space with a lot of random one-value variables. Another best practice is to only declare variables globally if they need to be accessed globally. So if you have if you have an array of data or something, like a giant array of data that you know is just there or something, and you need two different functions, one function will take only the odd indexed things and then put it into another array and spit it back out, and the other one will take only the even indexed things or something like that. But yeah, only declare a global variable if it's absolutely necessary, really. Otherwise, it's safer to declare variables in functions or blocks so you don't overwrite variables accidentally or access the wrong variable by mistake. Both likely sources of bugs. So this will cause bugs, So because if you define something locally scoped or block scoped, you know that the only thing that has access to that variable is inside of itself, right? So we talked about what is scope, different types of scope, global scope, functional scope, block scope, and just best practices, I guess. Are there any final questions before you all take a break? You guys okay? All right. Take a 5-minute break. I'll slide upstairs.